Good morning, and again, welcome to Anthropology 4310, Theories of Culture. And last time I gave a spontaneous or muddled lecture, whichever you choose to call it, on, I think, comparing, I guess if I were to give it a topic or a name, it would have been comparing ethnography under cultural relativism versus ethnography as encouraged by, the doing of ethnography is encouraged by more postmodern approaches. And really examining some notions that I really hadn't thought of until that moment about some of the, I think, improvements that, or refinements, or whatever, that postmodernism as a group of theories or a group of scholars brought to that topic. It was spontaneous, it was extemporaneous, it was spur of the moment. I really didn't realize before I gave it I was going to give it. So in my mind it came off rather well, but in your mind you may have lots of questions because I may have been in the atmosphere or lunar sphere or something. So does anyone have any questions about anything I covered last time? Again, it was a departure from the outline of lectures that we have that, by the way, again, are on your website under cultural materials. And I know it's true because Sean was able to copy me a copy of them this morning so I'd have something to talk about because I had lost my own lecture notes, being your typical professor. It's in a stack somewhere in my office. Okay, no questions? Okay, then not from our site student? Okay, then today we're going to cover more precisely culture and personality, and especially the contribution of Ruth Benedict to anthropology, which I cannot emphasize enough. Obviously, the shape that any one scholar gives to a discipline has its distractions as well as its contributions. But when I look at the larger field, especially of American anthropology and what really makes American anthropology distinctive from other brands or versions of anthropology, it's largely due to the contributions of Ruth Benedict, as encouraged by her professor, Franz Boas. I think I mentioned that anthropology is unusual in the sense of the number of women or females that have been involved in shaping the field. And no name is more prominent among those females than that of Ruth Benedict. But while it is unusual, or anthropology is unusual in the sense that it gave prominence, not willingly, mind you, to women over men in many cases, that had to do with the outcome of events, not a predetermined course. In other words, they weren't selected for their gender. It was by, I think, her sheer brilliance and power of how she wrote, the manner in which she wrote that gave her that distinguished position. And among her colleagues, she was, I think, superior. There were others, there were many others, at her same time, but none of them wrote as clearly and as basically and as straightforwardly as she did, and yet gave it some degree of excitement, some degree of popularity. And her textbook, Patterns of Culture, published in 1934, became a bestseller. Now, okay, you say, because you live in a time of bestsellers. They didn't have such critters back in 1934. For a book to have that kind of saliency, to have that kind of popularity, to have that kind of draw, was unusual and unheard of by anthropologists. For example, if you go back to Tyler's work or Morgan's work in the 19th century, or even Boas's work, it really was read only by other scholars, other academics, and it did not have the same kind of popular appeal and that her book Patterns of Culture had. And by the same token, that also caused it to be put down. But it shaped American anthropology, and you'll, I think, hopefully understand a little more why as we get into it. One of the axioms of the Boasian approach to the study of anthropology, an important question that he always asked is, that led to this field of, this larger field, earlier titled Culture and Personality, was this question is, what is the relationship between the individual and the group of which they are a member? That's a very important question. It doesn't sound like it on the face of it. Take my word for it, it is. It kind of helps to identify and give substance to this field known, again, earlier as culture and personality. In today's times, it would be, if there a course were to be offered on it, which I do on occasion, it would be called psychological anthropology. And there's an important reason why there's a difference in those titles, but it's beyond the focus of this course, so we won't be going that direction. But again, returning to this question posed by Franz Boas, he really was seriously interested in knowing, in the formation of personality, or in the formation of culture, what is that relationship between an individual and his or her behavior and the larger group and the kind of influences that larger group had upon that individual. You know, one of the assumptions back at this time was Freudian, was a notion that, and I'm sure you've heard of it, you know, one of the favorite things that I learned as a child, or favorite's probably the wrong word, one of the common things I heard as a child over and over again that was supposed to be part and parcel of the Catholic theology, Roman Catholic theology, was, you know, give me a child until they're the age of 7, I think it was, and I'll have them for life. And that's what people in my own family would use as an ominous warning to the depth of control that Roman Catholics have over their children. And your children as well, especially those of you who come from non-Roman Catholic families. Well, apart from the bias of that statement and the extreme quality underlying it, which is, I think, totally unfounded and unfair, because the same thing could be said of any religious group. Give me your child until you're 7, and it will importantly shape the adult that he or she will become. But see, that's not what Boas was emphasizing. He was saying, given any group that an individual comes to be a member, there will be an influence, there will be a shaping, there will be a relationship or an interrelationship between the personality that's formed and the way in which it becomes modified as they go through life. I'm old enough now to believe that and to have experienced it, and that's why I believe it. So it has personal truth for me, and I think for some of you, the truth of that statement will have some meaning. For others of you, yet you await to have that revealed truth for you. But again, it is this question of the relationship between the individual and the larger group of which they're a member. What's the nature of that? Now that becomes called, in the subfields or the sub-interests of anthropology at this time, again, it would be the 30s, 40s, and it takes us into the 50s and 60s, and for some folks even to this present day, culture and personality. All right, personality is what the individual is about. It's an abstraction. Culture is what the group is about. It's an abstraction. At this time, they're abstractions of the same order. And we'll be getting into that very soon. It has to do with this Gestalt version of psychology that I mentioned earlier. It has to do with, very importantly, with this axiom that the whole is more than the sum of its parts. And this is all part of the legacy, the mythology of anthropology. You know, in this graduate course that I'm teaching this semester, we keep going over some of these hallowed points that I presented here as, chapters in thought, as it were. And the different selections I've used just slashes them to bits. So I get kind of confused. Well, now am I supposed to give this or am I not supposed to give this? But let me just say we're not there, so we don't have to adhere to that. And this notion that culture is made up of parts and that the whole is more than the sum of its parts is an important aspect, an axiom of anthropological thought. And whether a person even agreed with culture and personality as legitimate enterprise for anthropologists to pursue, or whether they didn't matter. It was still, that aspect of it was still important. That question was still relevant. So it became framed in this subfield of anthropology as culture and personality. But the question that influenced the shaping of anthropology is, what is the relationship between an individual and the larger group of which he or she is a member? If indeed personality were formed by that parent-child relationship and those early years, the formative years, we even have that phrase in English, what were your formative years about? Well, that's really kind of admitting in many ways that early years are more important, because that makes them formative. I guess by the time you're your age, whatever your age happens to be, you're no longer formative. There's a linear notion here, as there is in much of all academic disciplines in the Western world. But to be linear doesn't mean that it's false. It just means that's a cultural precept that we have. And it persists in many different ways and comes to the fore in many different ways when we sometimes don't expect it. But formative is an interesting concept if you think about it. That's saying that what happened to you as a child is really very important. It explains, some psychologists and some therapists, with which I happen to be familiar, would really look to that area to explain what people are like now. I tend to somewhat ignore that in my own practice. And the reason is that I have experienced, as I say, the fact that in my own life I've known that I have changed over time. I have changed values. I have changed the way I view the world. I have changed the way in which the amount of priority I assign to one set of goals over another. I'm very different than I was, for example, when I was a graduate student. When I was a graduate student, I was very different than I was as a young child. I was a young child, for example, that led a Presbyterian congregation in prayer, the entire congregation, at the age of 11. The only thing I can see there that predated who I became was that I was before a large group of people and was leading them in some way with my voice being paramount. Maybe that's it. Maybe I'm focused on the sound of my voice. Not when I listen to the tapes from this class, however. But anyway, I had that really strong feelings of religious conviction that came from my faith as I developed it as a Presbyterian. My parents were not particularly religious at that point in my life, and so they didn't really influence much the way I thought about religious concepts and religious principles or religious convictions. So I kind of had some freedom there and was able to take into my life what I wanted and reject, and ignore, rather, not reject, ignore what I didn't find acceptable. And I put all my Sunday school teachers to task, because I would always be answering constantly all these questions. I'm sure they would rather I went to the Universalist Unitarian Church or some atheistic version of religious faith, because as I say, I made them do their homework and ask them questions many times on which they were incapable of answering. So then I could take the class over, whatever. But I'm just showing you, just having those different notions. And, one thing I want people not only in the class to understand, not only in the home audience to understand, is that I'm not anti-religious. I'm kind of more a-religious. This is what my sum total of experiences has given me. It's not that I think people who have religion or believe in religious precepts are somehow fell along the way or didn't get enlightenment. It's that experience has taught me that for me, it has become unimportant. Other things have taken its place. I taped Animal Farm on television last week, and I noticed the one big pig, I can't remember his name, was talking about that the afterlife or beliefs in the afterlife are an unnecessary distraction. You know, that what we need to be about as a group of animals is to improving the society and culture that our animals had on that farm. I can't think of a better way of talking about the whole generations, cross-generationally, of what anthropologists and sociologists especially have been about. It's been about being engineers of cultural behavior or social behavior, as it were, in which we were trying to make individual lives better. And each succeeding generation of anthropologists has attempted to do that, and each divergent voice in anthropology attempts to do that. I see that as very importantly what the postmodernist critique of Western society and their rejection of science, to the extent that those attitudes are shared, is about. It's about making us into better people, about making us into, in our own cultural context anyway, a more functional group of people. But all that aside, and just as by way of introductory comments, when I come to the work, this work called Patterns of Culture by Ruth Benedict, it is a most important book. It's not difficult to read. It's not difficult to understand. And it's been in print, by the way, from the time it was first published. You can go to any major bookstore today, ask for Benedict's Patterns of Culture. If they don't have it, something's wrong with the bookstore, or they're out of it for, just temporarily, because it keeps becoming re-edited, re-presented, republished, re-whatever. And 1934 to 1999 means it has some importance. It speaks to those of us in especially American culture and society. And I will be giving you 2 paragraphs from that book, and I'll be discussing those 2 paragraphs. You don't have to worry about, again, getting them down. They are on the web page for the class. Again, under cultural materials, you will have access to them after today, because Sean is going to be putting it on the website today. All right. This book is really about culture and personality. It's really about, a belief or an assumption, rather, that people as a group can be characterized in personality terms. So, for example, she talks about the Dobuans, which were an island people. And I may be wrong about this in terms of my memory, but I believe she labeled them as paranoid. Entire group of people whose early life and later life, the interaction of the individual with the larger group, had every one of them. In other words, paranoia was the norm. It wasn't, in this context, those kinds of psychological descriptive terms don't become fodder for a course in abnormal psychology. This becomes a course in cultural relativism. This becomes a course or a form of instruction in, again, answering that question: what's the nature of that relationship between the individual and the larger group of which they are a member? So in that case, in the Dobuans case, D-O-B-U-A-N-S, I always forget that you don't necessarily have the familiarity with these terms that I do, or that an anthropology graduate student does. Dobuans then are paranoid. Other groups of people display other kinds of characteristics. Well, how did she come to this point of view? what is there in her writing that leads her to this notion? And I have two paragraphs, and the reason I chose these two paragraphs is because, again, embedded in them is a lot of history of anthropology or anthropological thought that just becomes shared with you in that, in current writing, which would have been current at least in 1934. And people saw it as revealed truth because of the embedded history that was involved in it. Well, what I'm going to do is first I just want to read the first paragraph to you. Don't try to take notes on it. You could insert in here a handout for Anthropology 4310, Ruth Benedict, Patterns of Culture, and then capture it from your website, and you can print it out and include it with your notes. But you might be taking notes once I get to the point of discussing it, because what I want to do first is read it to you, and then I'm going to go back over it, line by line, and kind of explicate it, as it were, almost hermeneutically, if I can use that phrase. All right, she wrote on page 46, at least of the edition that I took this from, a culture, like an individual, is a more or less consistent pattern of thought and action. Within each culture there come into play, or in being rather, characteristic purposes not necessarily shared by other types of society. In obedience to these drives, or these purposes rather, each people further and further consolidates its experience. And in proportion to the urgency of these drives, the heterogeneous items of behavior take more and more congruous shape. I'm going to read it again because of the blunders that I made there, so you can get it. Now just listen to it. I know it's difficult to pay attention when someone's reading to you, but try to pay attention to it as much as possible, and try to retain some sense of what you think the paragraph means. All right, again, a culture, like an individual, is a more or less consistent pattern of thought and action. Within each culture there come into being characteristic purposes not necessarily shared by other types of society. In obedience to these purposes, each people further and further consolidates its experience. And in proportion to the urgency of these drives, the heterogeneous items of behavior take more and more congruous shape. What is she talking about? Well, she's talking about cultural relativism. She's talking about those cultural constructs, as it will, or you could even call them psychological constructs, of culture and personality. So she starts off by saying a culture, just like an individual, is a more or less consistent pattern of thought and action. So keep cultural relativism in mind. Look to your notes that you have on cultural relativism and also the readings that you have. Also keep in mind that notion of psychology that comes to bear here, which is Gestalt psychology. And then think of your best friend, whatever that means to you. You've got a best friend you're thinking of in your own mind. Your best friend is only known to you at this moment, and you're the one thinking about them. What are you thinking about when you're thinking of your best friend? Is your best friend named Sarah? Is your best friend named Jim? Is your best friend named, whatever? There's some kind of consistency there that person displays that you associate with them and that somehow come to be what you identify with them being. Now, this is an earlier concept of personality that psychologists had. They don't necessarily have the same one now, although, again, some do. But it's one that influenced anthropology a great deal, and in terms of that influence, loomed larger maybe even than it did in psychological circles. But if you think, again, of that best friend of yours as having a certain set of characteristics, a certain style, a certain persona, That's getting close to personality. I don't like defining concepts in terms of their own words. It has a gestalt. That person has a gestalt. That person and his or her collective representation, that set of mutually interdependent characteristics that you have, just like we described the Eskimo, becomes who they are for you. You know, Eloise is my best friend because, and then you have a list. And then you realize, and then if you were someone to ask you, well, what, you know, well, what's, but what makes that important to you? Well, you don't go to those individual elements in that list. You'll come up with some kind of summative statement. You'll come up with some kind of generalization. Well, she really understands me. She really is so much more sensitive to what I'm saying. She's so, I'm not making up a person, right? Non-narcissistic. So she really hears me, you know, and she really helps me out, and she always is there when I'm down or whatever. And she also allows me to give back to her. So not only is she a person that is there for me, to use the vernacular, but she also allows me to be there for her. So we're really, really good friends. We're thick. We hang out. We're close together. I don't know what the common terms would be today in the vernacular, because I'm just not out on the streets any longer. But that's really what she's saying. She's saying that, you know, just like we talked about cultures as having a kind of more or less consistent pattern of thought and action, we can also talk about individuals in the same way. So there's that kind of interconnection, that kind of identification. The same kind of definition that we use to define a culture, we can define a personality in exactly the same way. We could say, for example, that a person is a whole or a system of many mutually interdependent parts. Now, I've never heard anybody say it quite that way. It doesn't sound exactly like my friend Eloise, but nonetheless, that's really what I was giving you in real terms. So you've got that laid down for you now, that there's this kind of interrelationship that exists between a culture and an individual. All right, then she goes on to say, beyond this, that within each culture there come into being characteristic purposes that are not necessarily shared by other types of society. Well, that's kind of that fourth characteristic of the nature of culture, isn't it? It's talking about cultures diverse. And it's giving that new emphasis, or a renewed emphasis. And it's also saying something beyond that. It's also saying that there are many purposes that a group comes to have, but some loom larger than others. Some are more formative. Some are more instrumental. Some are more shaping, or have a greater shaping capacity than others do. So that, again, I'll repeat it now, within each culture, there come into being characteristic purposes, characteristic for that culture. But they're not necessarily shared by other types of society. So, for example, using a culture with which, or at least its representation, with which we're already highly familiar, would be the Eskimo. And the larger purpose there that I would say came to characterize their lives would be survival. The value given to survival. You know, not only could I talk about the importance of survival as a cultural element for the Eskimo, I could use it to unify and integrate and show mutual interdependency among all those elements of that culture that I gave for you. So she's saying that that phenomenon, that process, is characteristic of every culture. That every culture comes to have certain purposes not necessarily shared by other types of society. And then, in the subsequent sentence, she says, in obedience to these purposes. In other words, you've got a purpose. Now you've got to have a way in which you're going to marshal that group to satisfy the needs brought about by that purpose. She says, each people further and further consolidates its experience. Well, what she means by that is that they become more homogeneous over time. As time passes, there's kind of a solidity, S-O-L-I-D-I-T-Y, that takes form. A kind of, what? Well, solidity will do. And the purpose kind of brings about that. You know, in other words, if your purpose is survival, as it was for the Eskimo, as those people interact with each other, generation after generation after generation, and that value, that purpose, that higher calling that has, some of the anthropologists think, allowed or provided that group of people an ability to survive in rather extreme conditions, it comes after a while to kind of homogenize, you know, how those people think and how those people are viewed. And one way of looking at it is like think of a machine, because this is a very, by the way, mechanistic view of culture. A very mechanical view of culture. So think, if you will, of a machine. Think of your car engine. And think of it humming along if it's supposed to do what it's doing and it sounds good. And, you know, there are no problems, and there are no unusual sounds that you have to worry about, or your larger body or chassis of your car is not vibrating in ways it's not supposed to vibrate. You assume that it's doing okay then. But if you know that if you were to take an external object, such as a stick, say a large stick, and stick it down in there into certain parts, like, say, put it in the fan belt or into the cylinder itself, those things, pistons, I guess they're called, and think about what happens. It's disruptive. It probably would cause the automobile engine to stall, to die, as they say. That's what that consolidation of experience is about. As time passes, as that solidity is given, as those different traits are there, and we're talking about the traits now apart from the people who exhibit them. It's the traits, remember or recall, that become interdependent, not the people. It's the values that become interdependent, not the people. It's the purposes that become interdependent, not the people. And this is the emphasis given by this notion of cultural relativism, and now renewed in these paragraphs of Ruth Benedict. So that as a people, as individuals interact with each other over time, again and again and again, the kinds of values they have, the kinds of behaviors they express, that's what becomes kind of fine-tuned. You know, we hope that your car engine is so fine-tuned at the beginning that none of the rough edges have to be worn down. But I think in some ways that's the way they thought about culture, that over time some of the elements that would be rough or sharp edges or whatever would, in the context of that larger system, then be smoothed down. It would be kind of if you stuck the stick in an engine, like I just talked about, and you left it there, and the engine was strong enough so that it could defy the destructive element of having that stick thrust in there. Then after a while, it would become, its sharp edges would be softened. It would become more interdependent in a mechanistic way with the other parts, the pistons, the fan belts, etc., of that engine, so it would no longer be intrusive from the outside. Well, she's really using the same model here to talk about what happens when you take a culture, say, like the Eskimo or any culture, and you take something external to that culture and you introduce it. Because this, again, is what a lot of archaeologists talked about in that earlier chapter of anthropological history where they emphasized historical particularism. They had those trait lists. They were trying to find those, and they said those trait lists came about as a result of the interactions that occurred among peoples, groups of people with each other over time, and as a result or a byproduct of those interactions, they came to have those elements as being characteristic or identifiable, belonging, whatever phrase you want to use there, to those members of that culture. So, if you have, after time, a kind of distillation, values sort themselves out. These values are more important than those values. These values then become more determinative and more shaping than these other values. So the values, the pool of values that a group of people come to have, they kind of sort themselves out. They kind of shape up after a while. They kind of give you a new or a changing, but eventually a static notion of what that society and group of people are about. So let me read that line to you again. In obedience to these purposes, these larger values, these more important values, each people further and further consolidates its experience, come to be more interdependent, come to be fine-tuned, come to have their rough edges taken away and smoothed down, become a harmonious machine. Or, it's also an organismic model. Now this is a word or a concept that we more often associate with a corollary school or a school that occurred at the same time, but among British anthropologists known as functionalism, which we will get to before your midterm exam. But organismic is this same notion as the mechanistic. They really are parallel terms or concepts, as it were, except one is a biological reference and the other one is a physical reference. Mechanistic refers to machines, organismic refers to bodies, biological entities or organisms. And we see both machines and organisms as being kind of functioning, smoothly harmonious clusters of or systems of cultural behaviors and traits. So I'm going to be giving you some concrete examples of these, so I think they'll become, the clarity hopefully will increase for you. But the example I want to give you comes from an experience that I had here on the University of Houston campus when I was a young professor, lo be it in the dark ages. And again, in obedience to these purposes, each people further and further consolidates its experience, and in proportion to the urgency of these drives, the heterogeneous items of behavior take more and more congruous shape. Heterogeneous, that means external. That means intrusive. So if you take an item of behavior that's not a part of the inventory that typically is there for a group of people, and you introduce it to that group of people, what happens to it? Well, it either kind of goes past them because they really don't perceive it or give any importance to it, assign any priority to it, or they see it as having some kind of intrinsic value. And they accept it and they take it as their own. I'm thinking of when two groups of people come into contact with each other. Say a group of Frenchmen and a group of Americans. And some things come from French culture in the past in terms of our contacts and associations that we've readily accepted. And we identify then as being very French. Women's apparel of the night, for example, lingerie, would be a whole cluster of items that, I don't know how common they are today. I don't know. Today, values seem to be we wear nothing at night, and we have these kinds of lingerie items, at least if I can believe the ads for Victoria secret or whatever it's called, it would be before the night occurred. But in any event, that's one area of French culture which we seem to have expropriated, taken out, excised kind of, and taken into our own, and it's okay. It fits with some values that we already have. It's harmonious. It becomes more congruous. It takes on shapes, notions, nuances of American culture. But it's a French product. What other things can I think of that from the French come to us? Well, lots of notions about democracy and the democratic forms of government come to us from French culture. I'm sorry, did you have a question? Pardon? Wine. Emphasis given to wine. And that's not really limited to the French, though. That's really kind of pan-European. But we think of it that way. I mean, we think of a good French wine. I don't think of a good Texan wine, although there supposedly exists. Or even, now we're even more likely to think of a good California wine, or we'll say domestic, or or French, or some other nationality. But yeah, you're right. Historically, at least, the French are identified as having vineyards, as having the kind of climate that would encourage the production of really fine, above-average grapes for the production of wine. And that would be another area. But in terms of values, again, liberté, égalité, fraternité. I don't speak French, as you can probably tell. But those values, you see them immediately, and you realize that they're values that we've taken into our own culture. And in fact, some of figures in early American history were French noble people who were here and who were friends and allies of American individuals such as Washington, and importantly contributed to certain values in American culture, which are still important today. We still think democracy is something that everybody in the world wants, needs, and if they don't have it, we're going to give it to them, or see a way in which to give it to them. And then the anthropologists are called in to fix up the damage. I wish that were true. But the example I'm thinking of that came from my early experience was a notion of, there was a religious group known as the DLM. Back in the 60s, most of you don't know about the 60s, you just read about it in the popular media, which distorts it highly in most cases. But there was a kind of a readiness and acceptance and openness on the part of young people to other religions, especially from the East. Somehow people from the East were seen as having greater levels of enlightenment, and especially when the Beatles found their own Maharishi, or whatever you call it, guru. Gurus became the thing to have, and especially people who had money and access to wealth would try to find their own guru, and then gurus really became a lot like shamans in the sense that they were seen as local centers of divine connectivity, and they were seen as, my guru is better than your guru. And if you have my guru, you'll have greater connection with that larger divine reality. And for some reason, that had appeal to American youth. And today, we call some of them cults. Back then, we called them social movements because they were newer. They hadn't yet become reduced to being labeled cult. And there was this one group called the Divine Light Movement, and it was led by a young 14-year-old boy called the Maharishi Ji, and I can't spell it or I would, but Maharishi Ji. I think that would be M-A-H-A-R-E-S-H-I, and then a separate word J-I, but I'm not sure, so I'm not going to write it down. But anyway, in this, he was the founder of, or not founder, he was actually the second generation of holy men to have this movement here. In fact, he was the first here. I'm confusing you, I know. But let me just start off. There's a tradition or a value in Indian culture of having holy men. Indeed, if you were in India, many different parts of India, it's almost pan-Indian, as it were, wherever Hinduism is, in fact, you would have this tradition, this notion. And, you know, these men would renounce the benefits of material life, the illusionary aspects of the life as we see it, and they would seek a greater or deeper connection with the divine, which is really what reality for them was about. So they would go from house to house, and they would knock on the door if there's a door. In some of the more peasant dwellings, they wouldn't have that well-defined door anyway. They would knock on the door, and you would open the door, and you would see this person probably wrapped in distinctive draping of fabric, and you would know that they were a holy person. And you would then, he would say, and it was always a man as far as I know, he would say, is there anything I can do in exchange for food? And then you would think of some chores that you need having done around the house. And you would do those, he would do those chores, and then you would repay him not with money, but with food and lodging, so that his basic needs were taken care of. And these holy men would take vows, just like we hear some American religious clerics are supposed to do, at least mythically. And they take vows of poverty, or at least personal poverty. And that's certainly true for many, for example, nuns in the Catholic orders. I know it to be true. And it would be a common kind of thing. Again, you would despise or not want to accrue material wealth for yourself, and you would want to merely, your whole life was about becoming closer and closer, more in union with, going back to that from which you came, the divine aspects of reality or the world. It's not a linear notion we're talking about here. It's a more reincarnation or circular cosmology of events in the universe and the way they transpire. I can't think of a word that's not linear here. So anyway, that's what that's about. And so you have these holy men, and the Maharishi Ji's father was one of these holy men in India. And he founded this group, or this subgroup or sect, whatever you want to call them, of religious believers that were probably related to Hindu beliefs or Hindi beliefs. And they were called, whatever they were called. And it was his son then, as a very small child, somehow, and I don't know the particulars of this, ended up in the United States, sans father, but was the receptor, the inheritor of his father's religious teachings, his father's religious principles. But there's one he forgot or didn't take as seriously, and that was denying all material aspects of life. But it was your material aspects of life he wanted. So he appealed to youth, and he preached, if that's an appropriate term here. He communicated with youth. He had an appeal to them for various reasons. And many college-age youth became his almost disciples. And in fact, here on the University of Houston campus, the very first year I was here, when I was still trying to get used to the culture shock of being in Texas, at least I thought so at the time, had more to do with my own absurdities than the state of Texas. And I meant the state of Texas, not the state in the sense of the United States. They were on campus, and they had one of these Volkswagen buses, and it was all psychedelically painted, and I thought that was unusual, because it was for the time. It was the first time I had seen one, except on a Beatles cover or album or something. And they would sit around on the campus, kind of, cross-legged, Buddhistic position. And not only did I marvel at their limberness, but wondered what were they talking about, you know. And of course, other students would walk among them, and for the most part, most students would walk right past them and ignore them. But some students would be curious, and they would stop and ask some questions. And after a while, they would either go on themselves, or they would sit down for further discussion. This is at the time of Vietnam. This is at a time when institutions, especially American institutions here, were under attack. Traditional values were being criticized. That's hardly new, by the way. That happens almost, from my perspective at least, almost every generation. But this was this generation's particular encounter with those, shall we call them, foreign institutional elements. And one of the things that, one of the values, one of the precepts, one of the whatever axioms that the Maharishi Ji instilled in his followers were that you give up your material wealth, you join his group then provides for you, but he gets your material wealth. Well, that wasn't advertised quite so much, but I remember one time the Maharishi Ji was described as going home in his own, I guess he was coming from India because he had been home in one of his own 747s, and in the reverse direction was another 747 laden with different American used booty that he was taking home for his own wealth, etc. All right. They were here in Houston. They were everywhere, really, but they were here in Houston, and especially, as I say, among college campuses. And they were going to have a gathering at the Astrodome. It's appropriate for me to talk about this because in this year of the demise, seemingly, of the Astrodome, because at this time the Astrodome was new, and it was the 8th wonder of the world, or 7th, 8th, I think. And you know, it had worldwide notoriety or fame as architecturally, and all other cities at that time wished they had had that, and you know, the Oilers still thought it was a great place to land up and be before later things happened. But they were going to have the Maharishi Ji come there. He was going to give, you know, a talk. There were going to be his followers and devotees there. It was going to be televised. It was going to be so wonderful, so marvelous, that it was going to upset the whole world, and there were going to be thousands, if not millions, of people that were going to come, and that parking lot was not going to be full of cars. It was going to be full of new converts. So upsetting and startling was this whole experience going to be, or so said the followers of the Maharishi Ji. Well, they had it. The day came. I wasn't there. Somehow I didn't get drawn into it and become a follower. But it was on television in the sense that the news covered it. I can't remember who the news anchors were then, but you know, they showed the audience, and they showed the Maharishi Ji sitting up on kind of a it would be kind of a raised platform like this, only higher, because after all you have to see him. You know what the Astrodome's like. If you had somebody down in the center there where the Astros play, you know, it would be relatively small and unimpressive, but you put them on a dais, you raise them up high, and you know, they look a lot more important, and they're given a lot more importance, at least structurally, in terms of the architecture. And they had, you know, all the close followers, or the closest followers, immediately surrounding him. That may have been protection as well, for protection. But then there were other kind of, you know, you could have walked in there. You could have sat down in one of those seats in the around the Astrodome. And they did have about 20,000 people, which I think is fairly significant in this kind of thing. But it was hardly the thousands upon thousands that they had originally forecast and predicted. And it very much reminded me of a Billy Graham revival that I had gone to when I was an undergraduate student at the University of Illinois. And he came to Huff Gymnasium there, and hardly as impressive as the Astrodome, but nonetheless for its time was a relatively large gym with you know, him on a raised dais giving his sermon and having the invitation and the calling to salvation, and having all these students and other folks from this Midwestern community seated on 2 levels, viewing that, and some of them being so moved they accepted Jesus, and other people being relatively untouched but curious. I leave it to you to decide which group I was in. In other words, what I'm saying here is that this divine light movement became, in her terms, Americanized. It was no longer a part of this culture complex of India, in which you had holy men giving up all claims to material wealth, seeing as their entire life an unfolding, almost evolutionary, except that's the wrong, again, these words are the wrong words to use, kind of a greater and greater circles of experience that allowed them to connect more directly, more immediately with the divine, and in doing that, renouncing all of the individualistic trappings of their life, both material and psychological. So it wasn't really important there, as most of you know, or many of you know, in Eastern religions, what is saved, if we want to use Western terms, is not Norris, for example, but rather that part of me that is divine and that survives beyond the material body that I have and wastes away. And that's what they saw should happen in terms of their present life, and it's happening, is that you become closer and closer, and levels like an onion are removed, and you see as time passes and you become older, and you become wiser, and you become more conforming to this notion of the holy man, a person of the divinity, a person who has greater and greater intensive connectivity with that which is divine, which would be really the entire universe once you remove the illusionary or the illusionary aspects of it. Well, this is hardly what the Maharishi Ji was about. He had taken on some Western values here. He had kept retained some of the precepts of his father's religious teachings, and in turn those were connected to Hindu religious teachings, but they had been transformed mightily. They had become very Western. They had become very, very, I say at least in structure, Billy Grahamian, if there's such a phrase. And they had taken on, there were these palm fronds they had that they were waving up and down, and it reminded me of an Easter celebration, in the First Baptist or Second Baptist church here. Lots of palm fronds around Easter. I guess it must be a symbol of renewal, a symbol of life, etc. And they had those, being waved around the Maharishi Ji, and it was air conditioned, so it certainly wasn't to cool him down. It was to, I think, bring people's notion or associate them that the fact that it was a religious celebration and it was something that you and I could identify with because it looked terribly familiar and similar. And they also, in the audience, you had they had a few moments of seeing them. It looked like singing hymns, except, of course, I couldn't recognize the hymn because it was hardly a Baptist hymn or a Presbyterian hymn. It was something that was associated with this movement and the Maharishi Ji's teachings. But this is a kind of elaborate discussion of it. But again, the whole point is to say is that a foreign institution gets transplanted into a different culture, and what happens to it? Well, it took on the trappings or the important characteristics of the host culture. Well, this is very archaeological. If you go back to the archaeological discussions of this time, this is the way archaeologists talked about two groups coming into contact with each other, diffusing, accepting items or exchanging items, one group or certain items from one group being exchanged with members of the other group, and in reverse, so that an exchange did occur, so that after a while they appeared like each other. If you took a course, as I might have in my career, let's say the course is entitled The Archaeology of North American Indians. Something I'm never likely to teach, by the way. I just don't know enough about it. But at that time, I at least knew enough about it I could have done it. Because what they did, they used to have these, remember your old concept culture areas? All this comes together in these notions here in these paragraphs. And a culture area, let's take it out, let's remove it from Whistler's discussions that I gave you before and put it right into the heart of anthropology, which is where it belongs here. And culture areas were areas that were culturally homogeneous, like she said there in that paragraph. That they had consolidated their experience, and they had taken the heterogeneous items of behavior, and the heterogeneous items of behavior had become more congruous, or had become more homogeneous. They had been made to fit over time, and as a byproduct of the interaction of those people, more like one another. So what it would be like is Franz Boas, one of our favorite anthropologists now, talked a lot about Northwest Coast Indians. And if I have time, I'll be going over some of that with you ethnographically. But not today, probably. Northwest Coast Indians. And Northwest Coast Indians are those groups of Indians that exist from southeastern Alaska. They go along the edge, the western edge of the United States, from Alaska down along Canada and into Washington and Oregon. They have displays of their art. That's really what they're famous for. When Mrs. DeMenil was alive, she used to be one of those people who would bring them to Houston. Maybe the DeMenil Museum will continue to do that. I don't know. But they were really fantastic. If you've ever seen them, it's really a very distinctive art style. You'd immediately say it's primitive. But you would also, well, it maybe come from a, quote, primitive people, but the art itself is really attractive. There's really something in that speaks to me. And a lot of what it was shapes, images of animals, but they were highly stylized. I know they had birds, they had, well, any kind of animal you can think of that would be indigenous to that area, from, again, southeastern Alaska down along Canada and Washington, Oregon, along the Pacific coast. All of these Indians were called Northwest Coast Indians. And the reason they were called Northwest Coast Indians is because they all shared certain cultural elements in common. And they had this sharing of cultural elements in common because of interaction and adaptation. Now I want you to put both of those words down. Interaction and adaptation, or maybe you could say diffusion and adaptation. So you have this culture area known as the Northwest Coast. And it had certain cultural traits that all of these groups along this western rim or edge of North America shared in common. And one of the important ones, one which you hear a lot of talk about in anthropological circles, not anywhere else, was called the potlatch. The potlatch is a rival gift-giving feast in which one group of people would try to have the other group of people with whom they were in conflict or in competition lose face through, again, rival gift-giving. So I think Americans can particularly identify with this. It's kind of a variation or something with which we're not unfamiliar. The two groups of Indians say one was the Tlingit, one is the Haida. I'm going to write these out because since they're unfamiliar to you, it may sound like I'm saying one thing when I'm actually saying another. So the Tlingit were one clan, if you will, or however you want to describe them, and the Haida were another. But, you know, as an outsider, as a non-member of that society and those cultures, we would have seen two examples of Northwest Coast culture. We wouldn't have seen the Tlingit and the Haida. We would have said, oh, those Indian groups are just alike. They have these names they call themselves. This group calls themselves the Tlingit, and this other group calls themselves the Haida, But really, from our view, as Westerners looking at them, they seem the same to me. But of course, among these people who were members of different societies and cultures, collectively known as the Northwest Coast culture, which, by the way, is a label we gave them, not one they had, they would have these cultural features in common. So, again, from an outsider's point of view, it wasn't possible to distinguish among them. They did seem extremely similar. They were seemingly identical with one another. And one of the main institutions they had, which became well known, again, among anthropological circles, because of the exotic qualities of it, the unusualness of it. In other words, I'm going to give you a kind of play. You have to think I'm a Tlingit Indian here, or a Haida, or something like that, which, of course, I'm not. Never could be. I'm just not that warlike or strong. But, you know, individual notions of value and prestige for males in these groups was taken on by, as a result of your stealth, as a result of your collective success or successes in battles and in warfare with other groups of people there. So an individual or a group could take on greater prominence as a result of their success in differing battles, warfare. But this group really wasn't a group known for warfare that much. They really didn't engage in warfare that often. What they did do is they had this other cultural institution known as the potlatch. And a potlatch was seen as an alternative to war. So say this gentleman over here that I see in my student audience is a Haida, and I'm a Tlingit, and we come together out there in Northwest Coast culture land. And, you know, my family has been here for generations. This is my turf. Suddenly, out of need, he and his group come to where we are. And by we, I mean my family, me, my larger lineage, my clan. And they want to take over hunting animals in my area, or fishing, or whatever. And we don't particularly care for that. Well, I have two choices. I can either say to you, young man, we're going to fight with each other, we're going to engage in conflict and war, and I challenge you to that. Or I can say, which is what anthropologists would have us say, let's hold a potlatch. And everybody would understand what that meant. When we said let's hold a potlatch, it means that your clan, a representative unit of your clan is going to get together and meet with a representative unit of my clan. And we're going to have certain things that we hold dear, certain material possessions that we have that we extol and we lay a great deal of importance to, and we're going to destroy them. You know, there's going to be a big fire there, and I'm going to throw blankets are really important because it kind of can be a little chilly there. It's not cold because of the current in the Pacific Ocean there, but it can be less than moderate, and so blankets would be important, and were a measure of wealth in these areas. Woodpecker scalps were another item of wealth. In fact, they became almost a form of primitive, what we call primitive. Sometimes in certain contexts that concept loses all of its meaning, but for our purposes it works here. Woodpecker scalps became a form of currency, and if my group, my family, my clan, my lineage has more woodpecker scalps than your clan, your lineage, your family, your group does, and I can show any disdain for them by just throwing them in the fire, which would then kind of remove my wealth, right, or at least a portion of it, then I'm better than you are. Because not only do I have all these woodpecker scalps to throw in the fire, I still have a big pile of them over here left over. And he has, to keep up with me, has thrown as many woodpecker scalps in the fire, but he turns around to get more, and suddenly there isn't any. Well, I've won. And by definition, I'm better than he is. Or maybe it's not woodpecker scalps. Woodpecker scalps would be one unit of wealth. It might be actual slaves. I can throw my slaves on the fire, and it wouldn't bother me if I were a member of the Tlingit. It might bother them. And I'm laughing, and I don't mean, I'm just laughing at in my description of it rather than the reality of it. But anyway, again, that would be a measure of wealth. That would be a measure of my worth, not only as an individual, but as a group. Now, how do individuals and groups get this wealth? Well, they get it through preceding, usually warlike contacts, etc. In fact, the Northwest Coast is extremely unusual in the roster of hunting and gathering groups that anthropologists have studied, and Boaz importantly studied this group, because they're unusual in the sense that although they were a hunting and gathering group, their environment was bountiful enough that they had excess scarce goods. In fact, their goods weren't scarce. So they had a very bountiful environment. Life was easy, and they were able to, if you will, develop commerce and develop this way of exchange as well, although it was kind of destructive and kind of consumed wealth. So we could call this, if you will, an example of conspicuous consumption, which it certainly would be by anybody's definition. But anyway, in this potlatch, then, it would be used to resolve a conflict. And the conflict would be resolved simply by the fact that I had such greater wealth. I still have all these blankets, slaves, and woodpecker scalps and birch bark canoes. That was another item of worth and measure of one's individual and group value. I would have them all still left over, whereas his family would have already destroyed all of theirs, and they would have to slink away in shame because they weren't able to keep up. Well, the point is it resolved the conflict, who has rights over this land, without his family and my family having to go to war. I mean, we both accepted the terms of the contract, if you will, and we both accepted the results of the contract. And so off they would go. Well, this was something that, who knows what group originated this institution of the potlatch. But these groups had been in this area generation after generation after generation. Some of them had come from the north, some had come from further east, some had come from the south. Wherever they had come from, they had eventually settled in this area. And over time, they had exchanged ideas, non-material culture, and artifacts, material culture, till there was a greater and greater homogenization of the cultural inventories that will be found in both the Tlingit, the Haida, the Bella Coola, there was other groups here, etc. And so now I'll go back to that sentence and then say, and she says, in obedience to these purpose, each people further and further consolidate its experience, and in proportion to the urgency of these drives, the heterogeneous items of behavior take more and more congruous shape. And the Northwest Coast example I've just given you is a beautiful example of that. It precisely fits that notion and that descriptive phraseology there. Any questions? Again, there are some basic notions here. There are culture and personality notions. There are notions that there are groups of people, that groups of people can be identified as possessing or having certain values, certain purposes, certain goals, certain reasons for existence in life. And that some of those values, some of those goals, some of those purposes are more important than others, or they come to take on more importance. She even thought that in simpler, more simply organized societies, maybe they would just have one big value, such as the Eskimo and the emphasis given to survival. Among other groups, they might have a multiplicity of values. They might have several values that were all considered to be important and were instrumental in shaping the culture, but they might be, many of them, and some of them might actually be in conflict with one another. And that came to a way that she could use this approach to talk about what we today call complex societies or urban societies, or those societies that have become a part of the global village, as it were, versus those societies that are more isolated, more remote, more simple in terms of their technology, and as a result more simple in terms of their social organization. But she could use this same approach, approach of culture and personality to talk about these differing groups of people. And in fact, there were two different kinds of society that she talked about: genuine and spurious. And genuine societies where you can read hunters and gatherers. Spurious societies, you can read us. In other words, this is a way of being, that this view adheres or conforms to that intellectual tradition of being hostile to intellectual learning, centers of learning, higher education, as some scholars are called eggheads. It's that kind of denigration of what you're doing here. So that pattern of culture, if you will, is alive and well in not only